Good morning. I don't deserve that, you do. And thank you for being here today, particularly because you have heard that this organization is just plain nasty, that we have aligned ourselves with groups that are anti-beef. And I want to assure all of you here that we have no ties, no relationship, no affiliation with the Humane Society of the United States. And the litigation that we're presently involved in with the beef checkoff program it was the result of over a decade of RCAF USA member policies in which we attempted to reform the checkoff to improve it for U.S. cattle producers. And intertwined throughout the years of the policy developments was the request that the checkoff program be used to promote beef exclusively produced in the United States of America. And our request had fallen on deaf ears for many years, and so our litigation was simply a next step in accomplishing the goals of our members and nobody else. No one else was involved in the formulation of this litigation and the strategy involved in the litigation. This is yours. This is your successful effort to finally bring about reforms in a program that is working against your interest for the past 3 decades. But with that, what I'd like to do today is talk to you about your U.S. cattle industry. And as you know, this industry is under siege. We're being threatened. And we need to look at why. So let's look at first the current state of your part of this multi-segmented beef supply chain. There's really 2 parts in the supply chain bringing the consumable beef to the consumer. The first part are you, the cattle producers that raise and sell live cattle. That too is multi-segmented. Cow-calf producers, seed stock producers, backgrounders, feeders, and stockers. But then we move to the beef side of the multi-segmented beef supply chain, and you have the meat packers, the wholesalers, the distributors, and the retailers. So let's look at your segment, the live cattle segment, and we're going to use a chart from the CME Group, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, showing you how packers have fared within your industry over the past many years. You'll see the gray line along the bottom, and what that gray line represents is the 10-year average. So here's the average return to packers over 10 years, and it's just around $200 per head. But look at the more recent years. 2017 is the green, and here we see a period in June when packer margins exceeded $500 a head. And we see the red is 2018 moving up through July, and you see that the packer margins are up over $300 a head. So it appears that in our multi-segmented beef supply chain, there's one segment in this industry that has fared quite well. But let's look now at the feeders within our industry. This is USDA data. This goes back to July of 2009, which is the time that we had partially implemented country of origin labeling. What we're looking at here are the monthly returns to cattle feeding in the United States of America based on USDA data. And you can see intuitively across this 18-year period, there have been more losses than profits. And some of these losses have been severe in recent years. The average return, according to USDA data, for cattle feeding in the United States of America for the past 18 years was a negative $18 per head per month for 18 years. That's the average return to the feeding sector. Very important sector in our multi-segmented cattle supply chain because it's the last competitive segment of the live cattle process. So now let's move on to the feeders in whole. What's happened to our feeders? Here are the number of cattle feeders in the United States starting just 20 years ago. And we're talking in 1996. So the graph, the blue represents our farmer feeders. Feedlots with a capacity less than 1,000 head. The red represents the medium to large size feeders. Over the course of 20 years, the number of feedlots in your industry has dropped precipitously. And what we see is that it's the number of farmer feeders we're losing from this industry. We've lost 73% of them. We've lost 84,000 farmer feeders from your industry just in the past 20 years. So how many of you think that this might have some negative impact on the competitiveness for the sale of your lighter weight calves, 4, 5, 6 weight calves, to have 84,000 fewer bidders for those calves. So this explains, or this chart, the loss to cattle feeding, explains why we've lost so many farmer feeders. But it doesn't explain why we haven't lost them all, when the average return is a negative $18 per head for the past 18 years. And so then we have to look at what are the buying practices that are being used in the U.S. cattle industry in order to give some of these cattle feeders advantages, particularly those that are closely aligned or owned by the meat packers themselves. But we'll talk about that in a little bit, because now we want to look at the returns to you, the U.S. cow-calf producer. Most of you here are cow-calf producers, and this is a USDA chart for the past 20 years, and it shows the blue part of the graph. At the top of the graph, those are your operating expenses incurred in the production of a calf for every bred cow that you own. The red represents economic costs. The blue is your annual operating cost. This measures the short-run profitability of your cattle operations, and the red represents your total costs, both economic and accounting costs. So if we look at this chart, we see that for the first 13 years leading up to the partial implementation of country of origin labeling, even your short-run profitability costs were a negative $15 per head per year for your cow-calf operations. And then in the 4 years that we partially implemented COOL from 2009 to 2013, your returns per bred cow, according to USDA data, increased to $32 per bred cow per year. But then in the 3 years when country of origin labeling was fully implemented, when it was required for the meat product to bear a label that said this product was derived from an animal born, raised, and slaughtered, that gave consumers accurate information about your beef. And at those 3 years, your average return was $282 per bred cow per year. Now again, we're talking operating costs. We weren't talking all costs like taxes and insurance, capital recovery, hired labor. None of these are included in your short-run profitability. If you include all the costs, we're down here below zero. So in the 3 years you had country of origin labeling, your return per bred cow jumped to $282 per bred cow per year. And then in the 2 years that we've lost country of origin labeling, it has fallen 63%. Your return based on USDA short-run data is a $102 per bred cow per year. You've lost 63% during this period. So here, this is the state of the cattle industry. We see horrendous losses for feeders over the course of 18 years. We see cattle producers, even their short-run profits have been minimized significantly just in the past few years. Overall, over this 20-year period, you're losing about $500 per bred cow per year based on total costs, both economic and accounting costs. But if we just look at this level, the operating costs, you can see you fared well a few years ago, but no longer are you faring so well. So this is the state of the cattle industry. Packers are doing well, feedlots have been suffering, and cow-calf producers are losing their economic opportunities in this industry. And this begs the question. If you are an organization attempting to represent every segment of the cattle supply chain, leading up to the final feeder, and then representing the beef supply chain from the packer to the retailer, what do you do if the meat packers within your organization are earning $250 to $300 per head, cattle feeders are losing $18 per head per month, and cow-calf producers are losing their returns to their bred cows? What do you do as an organization representing the entire spectrum of this multi-segmented beef supply chain? You do nothing. You can't do anything. You're tied because you are serving different economic interests within the industry. So Tatum has asked me to do this a long time ago. This is the first time I've done it. I went to the NCBA's website to determine what their mission, vision, and goals are. And I want to compare them with RCAF's goals so you can see firsthand, and we're not pulling punches. This comes directly off of public information from the NCBA. So here are the different missions between the beef side of the industry and RCAF. On the right, you see NCBA's and the beef industry. Their overall mission is to drive growth in beef demand. RCAF's overall mission is to ensure the continued profitability and viability of the independent cattle producer. Clearly, there's a difference there. And then we look at their goals. How are they going to achieve this mission? Well, NCBA on the right says we're going to drive growth in export markets. We're going to adopt an animal identification system in order to expand our export markets. We're going to advocate for international trade so we have greater access to export markets. And we're going to provide the unique attributes of U.S. beef, which presently is defined as any beef product that goes through a U.S. processing plant. So it could be a steak from Uruguay that has been repackaged. It could be a live animal from Mexico or Canada converted to beef in the United States. No mention whatsoever on the NCBA's strategy side for what about imports? No mention. But look at RCAF. Our strategy for achieving our mission is to drive growth of exclusively USA beef, both in domestic and export markets, to defend the independence of our cattle producers by opposing a mandatory animal identification system, to advocate for strategic trade that allows us the opportunity to recapture the domestic market already lost to imports, and then to expand export markets worldwide, and then to redefine beef so that it is defined as a product that is exclusively produced from animals exclusively born, raised in America. These are conflicting, very different strategies. Then look at the conflict regarding the structure of your marketplace. We look at the right, the NCBA, they want to protect and enhance the business and political climate for the beef community, for the entire supply chain. They want to support new production technologies to improve productivity. They want to protect the business climate against policies and regulations. No mention whatsoever of any loss of competition within your cattle markets. RCAF, on the other hand, our strategy is to restore competition in the oligopolistic cattle market, to either break up the highly concentrated meatpacking cartel that is exercising abuse of power to leverage down your domestic cattle prices. And if that isn't possible, and it's not likely, Congress has neither the will or the courage to break up this cartel, well, then we need to impose some very strict regulations to prevent those meatpackers that has the ability and capability of manipulating the market. We need to impose rules, very strict rules, to prevent them from exercising anti-competitive practices in the cattle market that causes your prices to be artificially depressed. And then we need to rigorously enforce our antitrust laws in order to prevent the ongoing acquisitions and mergers that our next speaker is going to talk about. So very importantly, there's no mention whatsoever amongst the beef industry for the demise of your competitiveness in your cash market. Jumping on, we look at, well, what about the superiority of your product? RCAF says you produce the best beef in the world under the best of conditions, bar none. You meet the highest health and safety standards of any country in the world. You cannot expect developing countries to meet the high standards that you do because they have made neither the investment nor the commitment over time to improve their beef production as you have. You are the world leader in producing the safest, most wholesome quality beef, bar none. That's what we say. We represent the cattle producers representing the beef. What does the NCBA say? In short, beef is beef whether the cattle were born in Montana, Manitoba, or Mazatlan. Beef is beef. This is a direct quote out of the country of origin labeled litigation from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and the Meatpacker Associations that were trying to repeal your cool law. Beef is beef. That's a huge difference. We should stop there. We have an organization representing the entire beef supply chain, and they don't recognize that you produce a superior product, and they're unwilling to promote that product in the most important beef consuming market in the world. You know where that's at? It's at your feet. RCAF restores stricter import standards for imported beef. Why are we allowing beef from countries that are known to have an ongoing foot and mouth disease problem? Why did we relax our health and safety standards for countries that were continuing to identify new cases of mad cow disease? Why are we continuing to import tuberculosis-infected cattle from Mexico and not taking stringent steps to stop it? Why? It's because we're still being led by an organization that thinks all beef around the globe is identical and your product should not be differentiated. And RCAF says restore the food safety standards that we once required these imported countries, developing and developed alike, to meet standards that were at least equal to the United States. Do you know why we gave up that standard? It's because the United States decided we were going to cede our sovereignty and join with the World Trade Organization, an unelected, unappointed tribunal in Geneva, Switzerland, and we were going to follow their edicts. And their edicts were, United States, you can't maintain these high health and safety standards because that is impeding the flow of imports into your country. So what did the United States do in 1995? Well, we lowered our standards, of course. No longer do we require these foreign countries to have standards as least equal to the United States. Now they need only be equivalent. What does that mean? It means close enough. Now we no longer conduct monthly inspections of foreign meatpacking plants because the foreigners thought that was unfair. Now we do periodic inspections. Sometimes that's intervals of 1 year. We have got to restore the food safety and animal health and disease standards to protect the #1 beef consuming market in the world from the introduction of foreign animal disease that continue to circumvent the globe. What does the NCBA want to do? Create a standard to certify and verify beef production and management practices around the world. Ensure antibiotic stewardship. Good idea. Ensure beef safety by increasing investment. Nothing mentioned at all regarding the reduction and the erosion of our beef safety standards here in the United States. So now let's look at whose interests are they really representing. We'll start with NCBA on the right. They want to promote and strengthen beef's value proposition. They want to measure and improve our sustainability by demonstrating continuous improvement. I'm going to stop there because Tracy Hunt's going to talk to you about the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. They want to revolutionize beef marketing. They want to improve our beef product and product efficiency. Folks, for those of you paying into the checkoff, and you know what the purpose of the checkoff is, can you differentiate the goals of the checkoff from what this organization that purports to represent the entire beef supply chain? Is there a difference? No, these are your checkoff dollars that are doing these types of activities. So what is RCAF saying? We must differentiate the superior product of the U.S. cattle producer because only if you can distinguish your product in the grocery store, in the consumer marketplace, can consumers exercise choice, and by doing so, by exhibiting a preference, they will drive demand signals upstream in the supply chain, and they will tell the packers where they must source their beef and cattle to satisfy the demand by consumers. But without country of origin labeling, you give the packers a license to unilaterally decide from what country they were sourced their beef and cattle, and you can bet your bottom dollar if you're a shareholder, they will continually try to source the cheapest product possible to sell it to unsuspecting consumers in the United States with a product of USA label on it in some instances, with your USDA grade stamp in some instances, but with a no born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States of America label. So here's your industry. It's the single largest segment of American agriculture. You generate $70 billion a year annual, far more than corn, far more than soybeans, and there's 775,000 cattle producers yet scattered across the United States. 91% of those are family-owned operations. The family farmer and rancher in America still exists in your industry, the cattle industry. Not so in other agricultural commodity segments. And the economic multipliers indicate that your industry, the production of calves from your cows, generates $271 billion within our economy, and puts to work 3 million workers. Your industry is vitally important. You're the economic cornerstones of rural communities all across America, and your industry is rarely in the news. If there's problems with tariffs and retaliation in trade, it isn't the cattle industry they look at. It's some of the smaller segments of agriculture. There's an effort to distract away from what's happening in your industry. So the public is being told that the ranchers' herds are expanding to meet increasing demand in a global market. We're told that you're adopting brand new technologies and adding new practices, and we're told that a very small amount of beef is imported into the United States. See, that's to make sure that you act rather complacently regarding what's happening. But your industry, as has been called, is an endangered species if we don't change direction. You know, the average age of the cattle producer, farmer and rancher in the U.S. was 50 and a half years back just in 1982, about half a lifetime ago. Today, most recent data, 2012, it's jumped up to 58 years. We're eliminating opportunities for aspiring cattlemen to enter your industry, and we're doing it because every time the price point gets to a point that would attract new entrants and provide profitability for you, every time that occurs, the meat packers bring in more cheaper, undifferentiated imports to drive that price point down below where it provides any opportunities for anyone in this industry. And the organization representing the entire beef supply chain is supporting this very effort. So your cattle producer numbers are disappearing. We've lost 544,000 cattle operations in half a lifetime since 1980. And we're cow herd while we were increasing beef demand. During the previous 10 years prior to 2015, while beef demand was steadily increasing, your cow herd was shrinking to the smallest level in over 7 decades. And you've been told, well, we can explain that. It's the drought. Folks, we have not had a drought since 1975 when this chart started. This is what we call a trend. This is a downward spiral of your industry. Even after this short-term recovery, we haven't even met where we were at just a short time ago. Your industry is shrinking in terms of cattle producers, shrinking in terms of the size of your factory, the mother cow herd, and beef production or beef producer prices are faltering while consumers are paying record prices. Now, you've been told there's a clear economic explanation for why your cattle prices collapsed in 2015. And it's because, of course, that it's your fault. You were producing heavier weight carcasses. You were exceeding the supply or the demand with your supply, and therefore prices had to correct themselves, right? What we're looking here at a chart starting back in 1980, and the blue chart represents on an annual basis the production of beef in the United States of America. So you can see in the 80s our production was increasing and then faltered here and then began increasing through the 90s. And then here we fell. This was the anomaly of the mad cow disease issue in 2003 and 4. But then our beef production increased. And then we hit 2013. That's when your cattle prices were rallying strong. And then in 2014, look, your production of beef in the United States fell to a level not seen since the early 90s. And then in 2015, when your cattle prices collapsed and you were told you were overproducing, folks, the production of beef fell to the lowest level it is we've seen since before North American Free Trade was implemented in 1993. Your production was suppressed during a period that beef demand was increasing and that consumers were demonstrating a willingness to pay much more for beef. This is the red line. This is consumer price for beef. Beef prices were increasing steadily when the meat packers told you, we can't pay you any more for your cattle because consumers would run from the beef counter and they would begin consuming more beef. Well, the fact of the matter was consumers continued to purchase higher priced beef, and they purchased record priced beef at the time when your production was hitting an all-time low. Somebody was making a huge windfall profit as this was occurring. It ain't you. Your cattle markets are broken. Seriously, seriously broken. And here's a chart that somewhat makes this crystal clear. We're going to start back in July of 2009. Again, this was that partial implementation of COOL. And the red line represents steer price, heavyweight steer price. So you can see over time, as we moved on through the years, your steer prices were increasing from July 2009 after we implemented partial COOL. The blue graph below the line represents consumer beef prices. This is the price retailers are charging consumers for the beef. So July of 2009, your prices started an upward trend, and the retail prices obviously followed. Retailers were realizing that consumers were willing to pay more beef, and they were keeping right up to pace. Then in 2013, this low point right there is where country of origin labeling was fully implemented with the born, raised, and slaughtered standard. And as you see, your prices were reaching the highest nominal levels in history. Retail prices kept right up with your rally. And then when the market was broke in early 2015, when your market broke, look at retail beef prices. They continued to increase for another 8 months. And the industry said, well, that's normal. There's a lag, always a lag associated with the responsiveness of the final product in a multi-segmented beef supply chain. Well, let's accept that. There's a lag. So then retail prices fell somewhat and fell again somewhat. But folks, look at this spread. Look at the spread between your live cattle prices and the prices that consumers are now paying for retail beef. That spread has grown wider than at any time in history, and it started in the early 2015. What does that mean? It means somebody's making huge profits in the beef industry, and it ain't you. That's what this tells us. This tells us your cattle markets are broken and something needs to be done. Well, we have a president who has embarked upon a new trade dynamic. He is bringing us to a new paradigm. For over 18 years, RCAF has argued that these trade agreements are stupid. These trade agreements are facilitating more imports in the United States, regardless of the currency devaluation that some of these importers are using in order to gain an artificial advantage in our market. And as a result, these imports were surpassing our exports, and we were being forced to absorb other countries' overcapacity and overproduction. And worse than that, we were encouraging these other countries to produce more, to bring cheaper beef in the United States market, to eliminate opportunities for you and the aspiring cattlemen that might be in this audience. So we looked at one of the first things the president did was he's backed out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement. We said, great, why would we want to combine ourselves with other major exporters in the world, and we would become the dumping ground for all of their excess production and overcapacity? The next thing he said is we're going to renegotiate NAFTA. And at that point, the entire beef industry jumped up in arms and said, you can't do that. Canada and Mexico are our most important trading partners. We can't change it. Do no harm is what they told the administration. So here we're looking at the trade between the United States and Canada and Mexico under NAFTA. And we see the maroon here represents the exports of beef from the United States of America to Canada and Mexico. You can see that indeed we have increased exports. That's exactly what the beef industry set out to do, increase exports. But they ignore the impact of imports. So while we increased exports, our imports rose exponentially, far surpassing the exports. Over the course of the period of NAFTA, we've accumulated a $33 billion weight from the overproduction and overcapacity from those two countries and from the loss of opportunity in the United States. And as a result, the last 4 years, every time we sold Canada and Mexico $2 billion worth of beef and cattle, they turned around and sold us $4 billion. We sold them $2, they sold us $4. Let's go to Nevada, set at a card table. Every time I give you $2, you give me $4 back. I give you $2, you give me $4 back. Folks, I'm going to play that game until you quit. And the administration recognizes that. It's a new paradigm. We've never before talked about the impact of imports. Now we are. That's why we've imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. That's why we've imposed tariffs on China for cheating, stealing our intellectual property, for devaluing their currency. We've been in a trade war for 20 years, and folks, we're losing. We finally engaged. And most of agriculture is kicking and screaming, saying, do no harm. Agriculture is vitally dependent on trade. Well, the most important market is right at your feet. Let's recapture our share of the domestic market, then let's go out and expand market shares around the world. So what did happen? If it wasn't the overweight cattle that caused your cattle markets to collapse when we were looking at this slide of the beef prices, your cattle prices, and consumer retail prices, what caused your cattle markets to fall at the rate that was further and faster than in any time in history? If it wasn't because you were overproducing, what was it? Looking at NAFTA alone, Canada and Mexico, in 2013, you can see below, before the circle, 12 and 13, this was the value of exports coming in from Canada and Mexico to the United States. In 2014, when your prices were rallying, the meat packers scoured the globe to bring in as many cheaper imports as they possibly could. We increased the value of imports from Canada to Mexico by 41% between 12 and 14. By volume, that's a 17% increase in volume. The meat packers purposefully sought out additional, cheaper, undifferentiated imports, brought them into this market, and they caused your cattle prices to collapse. What manufacturing sector in America could withstand this kind of a shock in supplies and not experience exactly the same thing you did in 2015? Yes, this is going to be explained from the economic law of supply and demand. The fact of the matter was that the supply exceeded the demand, and it broke your cattle market. Now, once you break a cattle market, everyone in the industry knows you don't have to maintain the same level of pressure to keep it depressed. When it's broke, it's broke. And then it takes a long time for that market to recover. And those who are involved in breaking your market, they know that, and they intend to do absolutely nothing about it. So what's the real risk with imports? Let's look around the globe, and the United States doesn't even track this, but the Meat and Livestock Australia does. They track the heavyweight steer prices around the world. And you can see this green line above, that's you. The producers of the best beef in the world under the best of conditions, you command the highest price for your heavyweight steers. But look down below, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Australia. These heavyweight steer prices are far below the United States. In 2016, when we were reopening the border to Brazil, the heavy steer price in Brazil was about $62.50. At that time, your prices were $122. They're bringing beef from countries that can produce cattle at half the value, a third of the value that you do. They're bringing it into your U.S. market, and in many instances, putting a product of USA label on that beef. How do you compete with that? You are hand-strapped from competing against this growing volume. But look what's happening around the world as we pursue this global roundtable for sustainable beef, as we pursue global supply chains. That's the overall effort today. Let's improve the global supply chain. That ain't you. You're not the global supply chain. You're the producers of the best beef in the world under the best of conditions. You're the USA portion of the supply chain. But that's not what the beef industry wants. They want a seamless production standard that's met the world over. If the United States standards are too high, we'll ratchet them down. We want every country to meet the same standard. And that way, if JBS, a Brazilian company, decides it doesn't want to pay $130 for fat cattle in the United States of America, well, so what? They'll just reach down to Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, or Uruguay, Honduras, Nicaragua, or any one of the other 18 countries they can produce beef. The Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is a product of the beef packing industry that wants to control the global supply chain, and that isn't you. They simply want you to be a cog in the overall supply chain of the rest of the industry. So this is what's happening to your industry. This is why we're seeing cattle operations exit the industry, why our herd has been shrinking, why our production fell while demand was increasing, and why consumers are able to continue paying high prices even while your cattle prices are collapsed. So We now look at, well, what has the trend been with imports? Because we've been told that there's only a small volume of imports entering the United States of America. So now we're looking at a graph going, again, half a lifetime ago, back in 1980. The blue represents domestic production of beef. The maroon at the bottom represents imports from now about 18 different countries. And the red represents domestic consumption of beef. So we are unable to meet the demands of beef consumption in the United States. We do rely on a certain percentage of imports, and we have policies to lock that in. Because the overall goal for relaxing our border restrictions, for opening our borders to foreign cattle and beef, is that we need to make up for the supply shortage in the United States so these feedlots and the meat packers can run efficiently in an organized fashion. So we have to keep doing that. Well, when you keep doing that, you keep suppressing the prices, you keep eliminating opportunities for aspiring ranchers and for profitability for current ranchers. So over the course of time, through 2017, we have trended upwards in the volume of imports entering this country to meet domestic demand for our beef in the largest consuming beef market in the world. Right now, about 20% of our production is represented by imported product, either beef commodity or cattle converted to beef after it arrives in the United States. But this is very important. Let's shift now to our sister industry, the sheep industry, because the sheep industry is very similar to yours in terms of biological characteristics and marketing structure. We go back to the same period, 1980, and we look at the production, the blue graph, production of lamb and mutton in the United States. We look at imports, primarily from Australia, of lamb and mutton into the United States. And we look at consumption, domestic consumption of lamb and mutton in the United States. What we see is the sheep industry is just like the United States, hasn't been able to meet domestic consumption, and therefore we were reliant upon a certain volume of imports. Well, look what happened in the sheep industry. Through the 80s, the imports started to steadily rise, and domestic production was following domestic consumption. If consumption fell, production fell, and then vice versa. Well, then in the early 1990s, we saw an explosion of imports from these countries. These imports were coming into the United States, and they were displacing domestic production of lamb and mutton. We were eliminating our commercial sheep herd and our commercial sheep producers, and while we were doing that, these imports were coming in at a phenomenal rate. In 2012, they were bringing lamb carcasses in from Australia at $55 a head, less than what we could produce here in America. And by 2006, your sister industry, the one that we are following, the one that we are about 10 to 15 years behind, earned the distinction of being the first livestock sector in America to be outsourced. Because from 2006 on, we relied more upon outsourced imported lamb and mutton to satisfy what's now a growing demand for lamb and mutton in the United States. Congratulations. This is what happens when you ignore imports. This is what happens when you take no steps through the process of facilitating more imports in the United States regardless of the impact. So the question of the day for the next 2 days is, do you want your beef produced here or here in Costa Rica? A developing country that simply has not made the investment nor undertaken the managerial steps to produce the beef under the same safety standards as you do. So country of origin labeling was put in place in 2002. And then we lost it in 2015 as your cattle prices collapsed and the industry said, thank goodness. Country of origin labeling was the worst thing that could happen to cattle producers. It was a cost that they must bear that the consumer was unwilling to pay in the marketplace. And besides that, beef is beef regardless of whether Canada or cattle were born in Montana, Manitoba, or Mazatlan. Didn't matter. Consumers don't care. So let's look at the timeline of country of origin labeling starting when we passed it. And the timeline is corresponding with your lightweight feeder cattle prices. These are 550 weight cattle out of Oklahoma City. So in 2002, your prices were depressed for feeder cattle, around $90 to $100. Country of origin labeling was implemented. Over the next couple years, there was an expectation that country of origin labeling, now that it was passed by Congress, would soon be implemented and we would be able to distinguish our superior product in the marketplace. But that didn't happen. The meat packers and their allies reorganized, regrouped, they fought back, they convinced Congress not to implement country of origin labeling from 2004 all the way through 2008. So while there was clear that country of origin labeling wasn't going to be implemented, your cattle prices actually trended downward. They started to recover under expectations, they trended downward. Then in 2009 was the partial implementation. That's when the government said in the regulations that we will allow a meat packer like Tyson to slaughter one Canadian animal, one Mexican animal in their entire day's production. They slaughter about 28,000 head a day. They can do that for one day, and that entire day's production can be labeled as product of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So consumers still could not distinguish your high-quality U.S. product. But what the country of origin labeling did and why it was partially implemented was because there was a provision in the COOL law that said that the label on the imported product had to be retained through retail sale, meaning all the way to the consumer. So while we couldn't differentiate our product from that meat coming from Canada and Mexico, we could differentiate our product from the meat coming in from Nicaragua, Honduras, Uruguay, Argentina, New Zealand, Brazil, and the 18 other countries we were importing from. So that was partial implementation. Partial implementation, what happened to your cattle prices? Started to trend upward. And then the meat packers urged Canada and Mexico to file their WTO complaint. The WTO agreed, surprise, that the United States was discriminating against foreign animals, and they told the United States, you either must, they issued an ultimatum, you either change the regulations or you repeal COOL. Well, USDA changed the regulations in a very positive way. They eliminated that partial implementation loophole. From May 2013 onward, beef had to be labeled as to where the animal was born, raised, and slaughtered. Consumers, for the first time, could distinguish your beef product, and your cattle prices rose to the highest nominal levels in history. Took a couple years for that to happen, 2013, 2014. But then, the WTO and all of the meat packers and the NCBA and the American Farm Bureau all threw up their hands and says, COOL has to be repealed. And Congress fell all over itself and said, we agree. Because the WTO has now confirmed through a appellate panel that the country of origin labeling law discriminated against beef or cattle, or excuse me, beef derived from imported cattle from Canada and Mexico. So there was a 3-judge panel that was unelected, unappointed in Geneva that was overseeing this case. And the presiding panelist's name was Hernandez Rodriguez, and I'm saying that wrong. He was a Mexican national. He's an attorney. He represented the country of Mexico in trade disputes. He was the presiding panel on your COOL case in the WTO. Could you guess what the outcome was going to be? Is he going to vote against his own country and not be employed to file another trade case? This has the most inherent conflicts. This type of conflicting interest at the WTO would never be tolerated in American jurisprudence. And we have a president who's saying that now. He doesn't like what the WTO is doing because it's not following established law. It's kind of making things up as it goes, and it's making decisions that are not supported by the facts in the case. So there was an all-out assault on country of origin labeling in early 2015. Prices started to falter, but they then stabilized. But then the House of Representatives fell all over itself and repealed COOL in the House. That was in June of 2015. Your cattle prices hit a nosedive, and then in December of 2015, right there, boy, I'm shaking, aren't I? 2015, that's when the Senate followed suit and repealed country of origin labeling, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture says from this point forward, we will not enforce the COOL law. COOL was dead. Your cattle prices continue to fall, and these are your 550 weight cattle prices. They fell another $61 a hundredweight from the time COOL was repealed until October of 2016. And then look at your prices today. Congratulations. You're back where you were in 2012 with your 550 weight cattle prices. We have a U.S. federal district court in Eastern Washington that we joined a lawsuit with our affiliate, the Cattle Producers of Washington, and the judge in the case said that we have demonstrated that cattle producers were harmed due to the repeal of COOL. That was a very important statement from a federal district judge. We need to continue to hammer on that to bring country of origin labeling back. So, My time is just about up, but I want to tell you what our narrowly focused strategy is for restoring competition for you and restoring economic opportunities both for you and the aspiring ranchers who probably live in your household. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to restore country of origin labeling for beef so that the meat packers can no longer undercut the value of your superior product in your own market. Then we need to give you your markets back. Again, we either need to break up this highly concentrated meatpacking cartel, or we need to impose strict regulations to prevent them from engaging in the anti-competitive conduct that they are now engaged in with impunity. And then we need to renegotiate these trade agreements. We need to dispense with this notion that we are pursuing free trade. We're not going to receive fair trade in the globe. What we need to do is we need to adopt some of what China is doing. They have a strategic trade policy, the purpose of which is to give them net exports and to prevent their country from having to be absorbing the overproduction and overcapacity of other countries. That's what the United States needs. We need to rebuild America, and we need to do that in part by expanding our export markets, but when we do so, we have to have reciprocity from these other countries, and we can't allow these other countries to use their overproduction to depress our prices, to force our producers to their knees, and to promote the offshoring of our industry as what has already happened in the U.S. sheep industry. And then finally, we have to quit forcing you, the American rancher, to fund through the cattle tax, the beef checkoff program, an entity that is working against your interests because it cannot distinguish between the cattle producers in this multi-segmented beef supply chain. Folks, we want to stay on time. We greatly appreciate your attendance to this convention. We want to work for you and with you, and we will help in any way we can to accomplish the goal of restoring economic opportunities for you in this industry that is fast following the trajectory that our sister hog and poultry industries followed. And that is a path towards vertical integration where the meat packer kills competition and replaces it with a command and control regime, just like what they're trying to do in the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef that you'll be hearing about. With that, thank you very much. I will enjoy visiting with you throughout the convention. Thank you.